Well, welcome everybody to the first GSEC Grad School Workshop 101 panel of the year. We're extremely excited to have everybody here for the first of many. My name is Julio. I'm a sixth-year PhD student at the University of Utah, and I'm one of the co-directors for GSEC, along with Daniela Cosio, who couldn't be here today, but sends her regards. And I'll let the Grad School 101 team kind of introduce themselves really quickly first. These are the people who helped plan the majority of this, and you will be getting a lot of emails and seeing them a lot throughout the year.
Hi everyone, my name is Yanitza Rodriguez. I'm a actually I'm already in my third year, a PhD at the Department of Physiology at Yale University, and I am excited to continue with the GSEC family and coordinating all of the Grad School 101 workshops for all of you guys. So welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Pajedas. I'm a second year PhD student at the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology program at Cornell. And I just joined the Grad Workshop 101 this year. I'm very excited to bring super cool topics, very important topics for the first year for the whole direction of your PhD with very useful tools, so you can use that.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen Salinas. I am in my fourth year of my PhD at the University of Southern California in biomedical engineering. And I'm also super excited to help you guys through these workshops and get some really cool topics and some cool panelists for you guys to hear from.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for the introductions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our fantastic panelists that we're very excited to have on today. So first we have Dr. Yael Courtney. The doctor is very new, if I remember correctly. So Yael just recently graduated from Harvard with a PhD in neuroscience from both Harvard and Boston Children's. I know from experience in limited interactions and a lot of social media interactions that Yael is an expert at securing fellowships. So I'm very excited to hear from them today. We also have Luciana Custer, who's a fourth-year PhD student in biomedical engineering from USC and the Ellison Institute of Technology. Again, another person who I know has had a lot of success securing fellowships, so we're very excited to hear from them. And lastly, we have Dr. Joshua Schimel, who's a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara. And again, we're very excited for everybody, for all our panelists. So I don't know if Yanni, do you want to just start off with some questions or give them a short time to introduce themselves? It's up to you.
Yeah, of course. So let's start with some general questions that we've gotten throughout the years that I think it's actually helpful for a lot of you in this panel today. So if any of you guys could answer, how do you identify or start to identify any fellowships? And are there any resources you found to be helpful?
I can start. I usually recommend that people ask their PI or their lab first, as especially if, like it might be hard if it's a new lab, but it's often the case that certain labs have more experience with or success with certain grants. There's kind of the big overarching fellowships that a lot of people maybe applied to, but there's also some foundations that might be more specific to your lab. So just asking your PI and your lab mates about what fellowships have people in the lab been awarded in the past is a great place to at least start.
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking off of that, everybody knows about Google, but yes, talking to your PI is very important. For example, my first fellowship I got in grad school was a fellowship specific to the engineering department that they only give to one student incoming who has been nominated by their PI. I would also recommend, if you've already started talking to any department advisors who might be at your school and might be aware of some things. I also am personally an advocate for joining honor societies and interest groups that are relevant to you. A lot of times they're like $10 or $15 to apply to. But if you join a reputable one, they almost always have an abundance of scholarships, both for undergrads and graduate students. And the second fellowship I managed to get in graduate school was through the Tau Beta Pi Engineering Honor Society. And I only had to write like 2 paragraphs for 10K. So I definitely recommend paying attention to emails from any of those groups you may have joined. There's a ton for specific majors. And then my last one that's kind of maybe overlooked is definitely pay attention to your emails and physical flyers around campus. I've found a lot of not necessarily large fellowships or scholarships, but a lot of smaller sum amounts that definitely add up quickly just by looking at papers that I pass by and emailing them. Yeah.
Also, your university's graduate division probably has a collection of information about potential fellowships and scholarships that you can apply for.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So once you figure out, okay, this is the fellowship that I want to apply, what steps should they take to initiative the fellowship proposal? Like where should they start? I know that the websites usually give you a rundown of what to do, but it's so much information, like let's say the NSF. It's a little overwhelming. So do you guys have any recommendations as to where to start?
So my advice definitely varies depending on what it is that you're targeting specifically. Some of these smaller fellowships are not as involved, but yes, ones like the NSF or NDSEG can be more involved. I honestly recommend for anybody interested in applying to the NSF GRFP to go to alexlang.com. He's this person who won the NSF in 2010, and he curates a bunch of old application essays that both won and lost, so you can compare the personal statements and also the research statements of successful and unsuccessful applications.
Can you post that in the chat if you can, please, Luciana?
Sure. Oh, looks like it's already there.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you. Okay, so next question.
Oh, I'm tacking on a few more things. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, I can also we'll go. So the other thing is, again, check what resources are available at your specific school. I know at my undergrad institution, they had a prep course that was less than a semester that was specifically for getting you ready to apply for the NSF, and they helped go over all of your statements. They helped you like reach out and like figure out how to ask for recommendations effectively. So if you're lucky, those might exist already at your institution, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to say was, there's a lot of these smaller foundations and honor society type grants, but I think the vast majority of grad students that I know who are funded by a fellowship, it's one of the more like common ones, if you will, more award to more people. So like the NSF GRFP, or later in grad school, an NIH Institute's F31 grant, and NDSEG, though I have less experience with them. But for those, like Luciana said, the calls can be very detailed. Like there's a lot of information. Like I think the NSF this year is like a 40-page PDF, but it's actually really important to read them because there's guidelines like the font size and page margins that will disqualify your grant if you don't follow them. And in terms of NIH funding, the strict call and the rules are really important and will continue to be important throughout a scientific career. So it's important to read the call and the rules and be super familiar with it. And then start workshopping with your PI and your lab about actually the scientific concepts and what would fit well. But it is important to read in detail all of the regulations and deadlines and rules.
Yeah, I would second that advice that reading the instructions is actually kind of important, because there's nothing worse than spending weeks working on a proposal and then having it just booted out because it missed some criterion.
And I just mentioned this in the chat. There's the obvious things like formatting where you need to have the right font and number of pages and all that. But the NSF also puts out a very long and boring to read, but good for you to read document. They call it their solicitation. and they'll emphasize areas that they're looking to fund that year. So the first time I applied, I didn't know about this. The second time I applied and I did win, I did know about this, and I was able to tailor my research statement a little bit more to what they were seeking. Unfortunately, sometimes this won't be your area. For example, a lot of the things the year that I applied were more computationally based, and I'm more wet lab based or device based. But sometimes it's a good way to find keywords or buzzwords that you can kind of work in.
Yeah, the resources provided by various grant institutions often use buzzwords that will tell you what they're going to be evaluating your proposal for. So NSF, a big one, is your broader impacts and your intellectual merit. It's so important to explicitly highlight those things because the reviewers, as they're sitting down to score them, are going to be explicitly asked to identify what those elements of your application were. And many other fellowship applications are similar, and that if you read the hints they give you on what they're going to be looking for and evaluating your proposal based on, you need to explicitly tailor your application to answer those clearly.
Yeah, in my year, they were looking for a lot of quantum things. So I was like, okay, I do some light-based stuff. I can figure out a way to, like, I wouldn't have said quantum authentically myself, but I found a way to, like, sneak it in.
So I guess kind of on that, because the NSF has been mentioned quite a bit. There's a question in the chat that is asking for those who applied to the NSF, what did you feel was the most helpful when developing a successful research proposal? Was there anything in particular that you really focused on, or that you felt really brought your proposal out and really helped you get it?
I think it's important to tie your research to your broader impacts as well when it comes to the NSF. It's best if you can tell a cohesive story. So like the extracurriculars you pursue and the narrative that you're weaving in your personal statement ideally complements the kind of research you're aimed towards if you can swing it. But really the best advice I can have for developing a research statement is to work with any PI, like undergrad research PI you might already be involved with, or if you're a first year grad student, your current PI, and talk about the kinds of things that you're interested in writing about, but also like seeking their advice on like what they think is relevant, what they think is needed, what is a good question from the literature, and get somebody who's experienced in research to kind of check that you're not being overly ambitious also with your research proposal, because concise, concrete, like research design is better than super ambitious and unlikely to be achieved. And that was one of the things I got dinged on actually in my first application. They were like, this would take 5 PhDs to finish properly. So
yeah, telling a good and compelling story is really the heart of it. And proposals live or die on the quality of the question. There's nothing more important in a proposal than asking a good question, because if the question is not compelling and engaging and motivating, nothing else matters, because you won't get a reviewer to read beyond that. Or if they do, they're just skimming.
And this does mean some of the work falls on you to investigate the literature closest to your research area, to like look at recent reviews that may identify interesting areas to go into. But yeah, definitely don't be afraid to reach out to like older graduate students, postdocs, and PIs who have a better sense already of what a reasonable scope is, or what a good question sounds like.
So you all were speaking about compelling. I have a question here that was, what can I include in the opening lines? And I know this is very broad and general, but do you have any examples of what a compelling and competitive sentence for a research proposal could be?
Well, the opening sentence of a proposal defines the larger problem area that you're going to be working in. So the important thing is to lay out a problem area that your reviewers are going to care about. And that's where reading the solicitations and looking for hints as to what kinds of areas of scholarship are they looking to fund is critical, because you need to tap into what reviewers are going to be looking for at that point. So it doesn't need to be grandiose or glorious or full of adjectives. It just needs to clearly define the problem area.
And a question from the chat, Laura mentions the NSF says that they don't want biomedical research proposals, so no proposals related to diseases at all.
It depends. It really depends on how you phrase things because my application that I won with was making a dye or a device that would allow us to study traumatic brain injury. But the thing that I did was I de-emphasized the end application of like traumatic brain injury. That was more brought into as like a what is like the future of this whole project. And I focused more on the STEM aspects of it. Like what was I developing engineering wise? What was I doing technology wise?
Yeah, I've also seen successful applications that are motivated by a disease. For example, you could say this gene mutation in cilia is observed in this disease. We do not know what this gene mutation does. Given the disease phenotype, we hypothesize that this mutation impairs cerebrospinal fluid flow. I therefore propose to study the effects of this mutation in this gene on cerebrospinal fluid. Because you're asking a basic biology question, but it is motivated by a mutation existing in a disease, and that is acceptable.
Perfectly said, Dr. Jael. So let's move on. I think for those Isabella mentions for those who applied to the NSF, what has been most helpful when developing a successful research proposal?
I think we did that one earlier, Yanni.
Yeah, we did, right. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. There was one from Soham who was asking, I think this is very apt. You know, most fellowships are open to US citizens and permanent residents. And obviously for a lot of people, that's kind of a limiting factor. So they were wondering, are there any ones that are open to international students? And I guess just a quick plug, we do at the very end of the database for Científico Latino, you scroll all the way to the right, you can see the citizenship requirements. So we have that laid out as well. But still, if any of the panelists know of good ones that are open to international students or know or have insight as to how international students can navigate this process with such a limited pool of fellowships that they can apply to.
I can say at Harvard, one of the main ways international students acquire fellowship funding is internal fellowships through the department or the university. Many of those are open to international students. Obviously, you have to be a student here already, but everyone is right that compared to the list available to citizens, the list from like big organizations like the NIH, right, are very limited for non-citizens. But institutional fellowships are often much broader.
Yeah, that's why I kind of plugged a little bit about the honor society I joined because there was no citizenship requirement. You just needed to be a dues paying member, and that was $10 a year.
I guess also just to add one quick thing, as somebody who is technically international for most of these processes, look for private fellowships too. So stuff like the American Heart Association, stuff like that, like all those fellowships don't have, because they're private, they can dole the money out to anybody that they'd like. And kind of like how everybody else was saying, at that point, it's really about just trying to spin your research to fit the buzzwords or like the themes that they're doing. And even though it might seem like a long shot, sometimes you'd be surprised by, sometimes they want something refreshing, something that's new. And so long as you just make it spin it the right way, you'll be fine.
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to apply for smaller or less elite fellowships. Like, there's no shame in that. And a lot of them have looser requirements.
Okay, next question. How many, let me see how I rephrase this. How much feedback is too much feedback? Oh, Luciana, you're muted.
Yeah, I was just kind of laughing to myself about that because that's kind of a personal, I feel like that's a very personal question for like, for me, I can indefinitely seek out feedback and I can kind of drive myself crazy doing that. But I also have the ability to just eventually go, nope, I don't care anymore and set it down. And I don't know what the asker's situation is. But honestly, I would say get as much as you can from qualified people. So you might get feedback from people who haven't finished grad school yet, and I would weigh that less than from people who have, you know, successfully gotten grants and fellowships before or finished grad school already.
My experience in getting feedback is one of the most useful ways of doing it is to organize a group of about 4, maybe 5 people who are all working on things and just work with each other as well. That even though that you may not have a lot of experience in writing proposals or getting them funded, an intelligent reader can still identify a lot of the flaws and problems in the writing. And with 3 or 4 people working together on something, magic always happens. I really think very highly of the kind of the writers group activity as a way of getting feedback and input.
I was pretty lucky that we had a prep course, so I had 20 people forced to look at my things, but
Something I think about a lot and experience as I prepared various fellowships was it depends how much time you have. And I preferred to split my feedback into like in series rather than in parallel. Meaning that I would prefer to send my statement to only 1 or 2 people at a time, get that back, ponder what they had to say, integrate it before I sent it out to someone else. So otherwise you do tend to get in these situations where you send it out to say 4 or 5 people, and they may all say like really quite different things, which might inform you that that part of it is weak and needs work, but can be tough to integrate. I also solicited feedback from different groups of people for my research statement versus my personal statements for different fellowships. Sometimes I would send my personal statement to people not in academia at all, because really what I was asking them is, am I conveying what I care about and who I am? And is my personality shining through this relatively dry series of like things I've done? Whereas my research statement, I would send to at least like, you know, usually almost always scientists, depending on who was evaluating the fellowship, right? Are the people reviewing the fellowship going to be scientists? Are they going to be experts in your field? Who are they going to be? And I would try to solicit feedback from people who are similar to the reviewers. And also people in my lab or with expertise in my science, so they could help me find out if there were holes informationally in my research statement.
yeah, I definitely second like sending personal statements out to non-scientists. There is kind of a reputation of like, especially engineers, not necessarily always being the best writers, and sometimes that's true. I think some of the best line edits I got, I had a journalism major friend just look over, and it was mostly just for the structure of the language, just to make it more interesting to read.
We had another question in the chat that was from Alan saying, hi, I had the opportunity to work with my father on a couple of projects that have now been published in scientific journals. If my father gives me a recommendation letter, can it be prejudicial for me or at least graded lower? And I guess kind of I'll add on to that. You know, obviously with a lot of fellowships, rec letters are a very important part. That's something that you don't have a ton of control of in terms that you don't usually get to see them or write them. How do you identify a good recommendation letter writer? What strategies did you guys use to figure out who you wanted to write you your rec letters?
Well, I wouldn't waste my time getting a letter from my father because as a reviewer, I would discount it as being just too conflict of interest. But if there was someone else who was involved in the projects, I'd get a letter from them.
I don't remember if they anonymize your application for the reviewers, so it might be possible to have him write something, but yeah, I would avoid it if possible. It's just not a great look. But when it came to strategies in general for finding someone, you do definitely want to prioritize people you've actually worked with, not just the like pleasure to have in class letters. But it's got to be working on a scientifically related project or a technical project of some kind, or an internship that counts too. I wouldn't go back to like say my Subway manager and ask for a rec letter.
No.
You also want, ideally, the PI of the lab. Like I've had people ask me before, is it okay if like a postdoc writes it? And it's okay if a postdoc writes it, but you really are going to want the PI to sign it. Otherwise, it's going to throw up a red flag for reviewers of why did this person work in this lab and the PI is not writing them the letter. And so you really do want to work. And sometimes that can be awkward. If it's a summer internship and you're working for a very big PI who may not have a lot of time, it might feel weird to kind of work that in and ask it and mention it. But for hopefully PIs understand, they should all understand that when they accept students for summer internships or research experiences, that part of that reciprocal interaction, assuming you do well in the lab, is going to be that you're asking for a letter of rec. So it's okay for you to bring that up and ask. And then one other piece of advice I got early on that's really helped me is when you ask, make sure you ask if they're comfortable writing you a strong positive letter of recommendation. Because it's, say you had a rough summer in your internship and you didn't do very well, and you just ask for a letter of recommendation, a PI will usually say yes, but that letter may not be great. And you do want them to confirm that they'll be writing you a strong positive letter, because a lukewarm letter is going to tank your fellowship odds. So.
Yes, as the PI, I've often had people who've interned in my lab, usually working with a grad student or postdoc. And so I will usually ask that person they work with most closely to draft a letter that I will then take and edit and modify and sign off as my own letter. Because I want to make sure I'm getting the input from the person closest to the candidate.
I would also say it's not inappropriate to remind your recommendation letter writer of some of your more prominent achievements from the summer, or like what exactly it was you did if it was a very big lab. And it's actually like okay to be like, hey, do you want to get a coffee and talk about like what we're going to put in this letter together? I mean, hopefully you already have a decent enough relationship that they're not going to immediately slam the door in your face.
Yeah, I've also had to catch up PIs with whom I haven't worked in years, right? So coming into grad school and like years into grad school, as I'm applying to fellowships near the end, it's like I haven't worked with one of my recommenders in 5 years. And so I'll always offer to summarize like what's been going on recently over email, or now meet over Zoom. Would they like to chat over Zoom so I can catch them up on not only what I've done, but maybe what the goals of this particular fellowship are, so they can kind of mention in the letter, oh, I strongly support her application to this fellowship, etc. And if they don't have time, they'll say no. But
Cool. I think there's another question in the chat that kind of linked to it. It's NSF specific to start, but I think the premise of it is can be broad. It's, the NSF recommends getting letters from a variety of recommenders, not just PIs, to show that you're a well-rounded applicant. And I think a lot of other fellowships are kind of the same way. Have any of you had success with solely using PIs as recommenders? And is there a way to strategize what you ask the PIs to write about to demonstrate well-roundedness as a candidate?
What kind of helped was I was very vocal with my undergraduate PI about all of the extracurriculars I was involved in and what I was passionate about. So yeah, he knew me from research, but he also knew that I was very interested in helping community college students transfer. He knew that I was interested in mental health organizations. These are like, you can talk about other volunteer or extracurricular activities or like honor society activities that you do, and get them to plug those.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What specific factors or standards do selection committees typically consider during their evaluation process?
I think it depends a lot on the grant or fellowship, but they'll tell you almost always in the announcement of the fellowship. So there's some that are very standardized, like the F31 and the NSF, and some that I think are not as much.
I'm sorry, I think I missed the question.
So what specific factors or standards do selection committees typically consider during their evaluation process?
Then yeah, I agree with Yale. Like they'll usually articulate it pretty clearly, especially I mean the NSF hammers in over and over that they want broader impacts and intellectual merit, for example. Other ones are more generalized, like the Tau Beta Pi Fellowship. They just wanted to see some kind of like 2-paragraph statement about why engineering was important to you or whatever. But yeah, they'll put it in their prompt. They'll put it in their solicitation.
And what a reader is looking for is a compelling narrative that really shows that you know what you're doing and you know where you're going, and that you've really thought through how to integrate your background with the direction that you're developing. We all know that the actual research proposal you put together is probably a work of fiction, but it still needs to show that you can go through that process of developing a research project and really thinking through the question and how to articulate it and how to support it and how that fits in with the rest of the package.
I think just to kind of delineate even broad categories, the NSF is funding you as a scientist, super not the project. Like, that's why you can apply as a senior undergrad for your grad school. There's no way you're doing the project you proposed, right? At that point, it's entirely fiction, but they're asking, can you propose a reasonable scientific hypothesis instead of experiments that would answer it? Whereas like an F31, the NIH does want to see a reasonable set of experiments that you could do in your current lab in the course of a PhD that also aligns with your career training goals as a trainee. And then fully separate HHMI Gilliam Fellowship, for example, prioritizes not only you as a person, both your dedication to enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and your leadership potential, but also very much your project and also your mentor's leadership. And so that one, but all of these organizations tell you what they're prioritizing, what they're looking for, and some don't care about some elements that others care very much about. And so you really have to look at the solicitation and see what they're telling you they're going to score you on.
Is it true that you can only apply to just one, let's say NSF, F31, and Gillian?
Well, you can apply to as many as you want, as far as I'm aware. But yes, in my case at least, once I accepted the NSF fellowship, I cannot get any NIH funding, and I also can't pursue other like DOE, DOD type things.
You can almost always only hold one. But what I did is I applied to NSF and HHMI Gilliam in the same year. I was awarded them in the same year. I accepted NSF because the award notification came out months before the Gilliam award notification even came out. So I accepted it, of course. And so then what happened is I found out I also got Gilliam several months later. So I deferred the Gilliam money for 1 year, which means I still get the 3 years of support the fellowship offers, but it doesn't start for a year. NSF is supposed to be 2 years, and it's not super great to only take it for 1 year. But given my standing, I was in a place where I was like, look, I could have the rest of my PhD fully funded. So I had already accepted the NSF. Then after 1 year, I informed them, hi, I'm going to stop my funding with you. Thank you very much. And then I accepted the HHMI Gilliam for the next 3 years. And it worked fine.
So related to that, I deferred my NSF for my first year that I had it, so I could take advantage of the Tau Beta Pi fellowship and get that money in. But they give you 3 years of funding spread over 5 years, so you can choose to allocate them as you wish.
It can get complicated to figure out, and even the funding office at my university didn't really know what to do, and so it was on me to like email the fellowships and ask about flexibility and deferment and what the rules were to really make sure I was maximizing the funding that I was awarded. But to go back to the initial question, apply broadly. As much as you have bandwidth to put together good applications for multiple awards, it doesn't hurt. And then if you get multiple, that's a crazy good problem to have, and you're in a wonderful place.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the shotgun method.
There's a question in the chat that's asking, is there a difference between applying for fellowships as an undergrad versus as a graduate student?
Well, when I read those kinds of applications, I look for a more mature application from someone who's already in graduate school. And I look for a project that's more directly tied to what the lab group is doing. And that it really is going to be a compelling story that's growing from the work you're already beginning to do.
Yeah, I would say in the case of the NSF at least, there is a big difference. You get weighted differently. Your research statement, like Dr. Schimel just said, like needs to be more relevant to what you could actually do. But also, like when you're an undergrad, you can say you're going to do a bunch of things in your first and second year of grad school, But when you're in your second year of grad school, you can't just go back and rewrite history. So. But also, like, there's some that are only available to undergrads, and then there are some that are only available to like grad students who have already enrolled at a particular institution. So, I mean, you just got to carefully check the details of the application.
I do think it's wonderful to start to get experience applying to fellowships as an undergrad, though, if you feel like you have the support or the infrastructure to do so. Because if you're going to go to grad school, and especially if you intend to stay in academia beyond, it's going to be a skill that's indispensable forever. And the earlier you start, the better you'll be.
Yeah, I didn't win with my undergrad application to the NSF, but it was one of the most informative and educational experiences about the process of, I don't know, just doing a lot of academic things, which tends to be applying for things and trying to get positions and trying to get the right rec letters. So it is, I would definitely recommend it as well.
Oh yeah, and they give you back a feedback form, correct?
Mm-hmm.
At least for
The
the
NSF is one of the few to do that, yes.
That could be highly beneficial. Next question. When should one begin the preparation process? I know you guys said as early as possible. But also, how can previous submissions be leveraged when starting a new application?
Well, you can always start with the skeleton of the previous one. There's no reason you can't reuse a lot of text. But starting early so you have time to go through multiple iterations of revision and input is going to be really valuable.
Yeah, so a lot of that's going to depend on how quickly you can get people to turn around drafts and how quickly you can integrate their advice. Personally, for if you're a senior undergrad interested in the NSF and applying to grad school as well, I would structure the timeline so that way you are writing your personal statements for both around the same time, because you can crib a lot of the same paragraphs from each other. I think my personal statement for grad school apps were like almost identical to an NSF application.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of my grad school fellowship applications took place my second year of my PhD. And my program was rotation based, which meant the whole first year I hadn't really officially joined a lab. I officially joined a lab in the June leading into my second year, at which point I naturally started thinking about my PhD project, right, broadly, which is what's going to inform these fellowship applications. I applied that year for the NSF and the Gilliam. NSF was due October, Gilliam was due December 10th. And by August, I had a really bad draft of the NSF, basically. I had an outline and a bad draft. I had workshopped it with my lab at lab meetings in terms of the concept. Personal statement, I just upcycled from grad school applications, right? Adding in a bit more depth. With the science statement, the NSF that year, I think, was 2 pages and the Gilliam was 5. So I had my NSF in October. There's 2 pages, worked really hard, but again, drafted by August. And then I continued to workshop that. And I pivoted my focus from the NSF to the Gilliam after that October 15th deadline, at which point I had like 2 more months. And the Gilliam's a massive application, so it really did take about that long to get it together. But that allowed me to get like really multiple rounds of feedback from a lot of people and make it as strong as possible.
Yeah, I'd definitely give it at least a few months because you want to be able to sit and digest on what you've written also. I would look at a draft like a week later and be like disgusted and be like, oh, this is all terrible. I need to redo this.
I will say though that now I'm working with Científico Latino again as like an NSF GRP reviewer, and I also do that for Harvard. And our timeline, I asked for a full first draft of my mentee statements on September 9th for the NSF, which the final is due, mid-October. And we're iterating to a second draft by September 23rd. So that's a bit of a more accelerated timeline. And then as such, these mentees do have to commit, I think, more time to investing in it and really polishing along that shorter timeline.
All right, there's another question in the chat that I think is a pretty good one. It's how do reviewers evaluate the name and the lab of the PI you mentioned in the research statement with whom you're proposing to do research? So I guess kind of on basically how much does academic prestige matter, when you're applying to some of these fellowships, especially if when you're thinking also about labs you're joining like a young PI versus like a more established PI that might have a bit more of a pull on your field.
When I've reviewed these, I haven't paid that much attention to the lab they were going into specifically, so long as there was a good match between the research and the work that was going on in the lab. But we're funding the student, not the PI.
The PI specifically might not have the equipment that you're mentioning in your statement also, but it might be something available at the facilities in that school in general, which like if you do the legwork to go say, I will use the instrumentation in this department's core, like then that can actually be a good thing to include. But I don't think people are going to hardcore fact check like, oh, did they have this specific centrifuge or whatever that you asked for? Especially since you're not really doing the research.
There's been some cases where I've thought about this. If for example, I'm proposing a method that's like famously really hard and my lab doesn't have a track record with, then I've been sure to, well, this is more for like an NIH style application, like actually have like a letter of support or like have someone who does know how to do this method who has confirmed to me that they will help me troubleshoot and optimize this famously hard method, right? And so if it's a method that's truly so novel or difficult that it might catch your reviewer's eye, like, oh, they're proposing to do that, there's no way, then it can be useful to add a line being like, you know, I have the support of so-and-so at this institution to make sure I get this up and running.
And
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in my application, I did specifically say, oh, we have collaborators at a different university that were already, like, there are already existing projects between the two labs. So, like, I'm going to lean on them for their expertise in the, like, organoid culturing part of this.
And that's part of putting together a mature proposal and showing that you've really thought through how you're going to do the work, thinking about the methods you're proposing to use, and is the expertise and is the hardware available in the lab where you're going to be working, or with some collaborative arrangement or institutional core, but that you're not just sort of flying by the seat of your pants.
Yeah, I was able to like emphasize that my lab was moving towards more interdisciplinary things because my PI happens to be a physics lady. She works really mostly with like optics and waveforms and those types of things, but she wanted to move into imaging of systems. So I was able to kind of say, yes, I'm not a physics person, but that's a good thing. I'm a bio person and I'm bringing this expertise to the lab and we're going to get some great synthesis here.
Awesome. I think there's another question in the chat that is asking if you've received a small internal research grant from your program, would it improve or lessen your chances for the NSF? And I guess that could also be for other fellowships as well. How does having like maybe smaller fellowships impact that?
Improve or no effect. But if you've got some money to support the research, again, that just makes the proposal look more complete, more mature, more thought out. NSF is still looking fundamentally to fund the student. So if the student looks exciting, they're more likely to get funded.
Yeah, it can be like something that corroborates your capacity to win things and write compelling statements. They might not notice it, but another line in your resume is not going to hurt you.
Dr. Schimel, I have a question. You mentioned that you reviewed grants before. What memorable, good and bad, have you encountered?
Well, I'm not supposed to actually talk about any of the specifics.
No specifics needed, but
the most memorable bad one I think I've seen is one where it's just wall-to-wall gray text with no white space, no figures, no nothing, just a wall of just text. So there's a reviewer, I've seen this thing where there is equations embedded within the body of the paragraphs. And I just took one look at it, and my initial reaction, gut feeling is, I hate you. You're making me read through this, horrible, dense mass of words.
Yeah.
And I'm not happy about that. I've read many really good proposals too, and just in terms of the visual, they usually have a figure on the first page, they have some white space between the paragraphs. they're clearly thinking about the fact that some human is actually going to read this and they're going to have immediate gut reactions to things. But certainly what's always most compelling for me really is an exciting problem and an exciting question.
Yeah, they should always remember that you guys are reading these at like 9 p.m. after days of work. Like, don't make it as complicated. It's not gonna sound engaging. It's gonna do the opposite.
Yeah, I usually say that you figure that the reviewer's reading the first half of the proposal on the flight into O'Hare and reading the second half of the proposal on the flight out of O'Hare. So you'd better make sure that the pieces fit together and hold together.
That's true. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just kind of related to him bringing up formatting. This is something that I picked up from the applications on the Alex Lang website, and I had never seen before, and it has changed how I write a lot of my personal statements. But if there's something you want to emphasize, or like a really cool award you won, or something really impressive that you did, bold that part of the line, or somehow draw attention to it with the formatting. It breaks up the text so it doesn't look so awful and chunky.
I just want to add before we follow to the ending of the Q&A session, I'll put in the chat Josh Schimel's book on writing science that can help with the actual writing part of your fellowship applications, and maybe you can find it in your library at your university.
That would be great. Thank you, Julia.
I think there's one more question in the chat that Yael has kind of done some groundwork on already. So thanks, Yael. Are there fellowships that consider your research proposal to be the work that you will actually do in the mentors lab? So like it has to be pretty realistic. And if so, at that point, is it fair to say that the formula of realistic expectations and telling a good story becomes the most important elements to emphasize? And maybe if people know of some that are like that, so people can kind of be aware.
I think most expect you to more or less do what you propose, with the exception of the NSF. But there's different levels of flexibility and accountability in reporting on kind of whether you stick to that. And like the Gilliam, for example, I proposed my project and they funded me for that project, but they understand that things change and you have to optimize. But I have to present at least 2 posters a year at fellow meetings for that. And so there is accountability where I have to show what I'm working on, how it's pivoted, why it's pivoted. And some are stricter still. Like I think the Department of Defense is graduate fellowships are stricter even in their annual reporting of like, are you doing this project? If not, why not? And I also mentioned that if you get support as a graduate student from a foundation like the American Heart Association or like our lab, the Pediatric Hydrocephalus Foundation, these foundations did explicitly fund research that was supposed to help people with these conditions in my case. And not only are they going to hold you accountable, but also our lab has site visits from patients and their families where if you're supported by these grants, you have to present your work to these families and explain how what you're doing is contributing to knowledge that will hopefully help these patients. And so there's definitely a range, but I think in general, it's safe to assume you should intend to do what you're proposing, with the exception if you apply to the NSF as an undergrad or a first-year grad student, there's more wiggle room.
Yeah, I mean, all proposals are at some level works of fiction, because if you really knew exactly how the experiments would go, you probably didn't need to do them. But they shouldn't be works of fantasy at this level. They should be pretty coherent. We're going to do this, and so long as the experiments work, we will follow in this line. And if things go haywire, then you will shift focus, but you should still be guided by the proposal you wrote.
Yeah, and even though when I wrote my applications, I didn't know what research I was going to be doing because I did ANSF, I still tried to write in like contingency plans as if it was the real research I was going to do. Because like you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You should support with the like evidence from like literature or previous works like that says, you know, this is why I expect to get this kind of result. Like it's not just something I'm pulling out of my head. But you should also plan for failure too. And it can be hard to do all that in 2 pages.
Yeah. I think one thing I wanted to just ask before we run out of time, the issue of like formatting, stuff like that can sometimes be an afterthought, especially when you're thinking about how you want to present the fellowship. Are there any other things that in your guys' experience, either reviewing or writing fellowships, that you come to realize are actually pretty important that might not be so obvious?
Framing the problem and framing the question are the things that will sell a proposal. All your methods are only points of failure, because if I'm not excited by your questions, then the proposal is dead in the water and it doesn't matter what you're actually going to do. But if I am excited by your questions, then you just need to show me that you have a reasonable shot at actually accomplishing those. So you sell a proposal with your question.
I know I'm mentioning this a lot, but know what they're looking for. Like these awards have websites. There's many of them have webinars that are recorded and explain what they're looking for and what characterizes successful application. Watch them and do that. Like I've helped so many students apply to the Gilliam who just didn't watch the webinar, even if I sent it to them. And then when their application is missing the emphasis on these components, the webinar said to emphasize. I go back, I'm like, well, did you watch this? They're like, no. I'm like, the leaders of the fellowship told you what they were looking for. You got to use the hints you have as you're shaping your application.
Cool. Are there any other questions from any members of the chat? Anything else you guys want to ask? Well, I'll give it a minute and see. I guess in the meantime,
Oh, sorry,
since
I
we're
was
kind of
muted.
close.
I was muted.
Oh.
Sorry, I wanted to mention that for the Gillian, it's very important to have a strong mentor and student relationship, and not many students have that. And so just keep an eye on that, especially we're going to have different workshops that help you navigate on choosing a lab and what mentors to look for, because those are either going to help you in the long run or burn down any other opportunities like that grant.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As somebody who applied to the Gilliam, like there's a lot of different things that end up playing a factor that don't necessarily play a factor in other fellowships, and unless you're aware of all of them, like they will catch you off guard, and it's places where they can ping you. There's every applicant that is in that pool is incredible, and so it's the tiniest differences that people are looking for. I guess since we have like around 5 minutes left, is there any like closing wisdom or like pieces of advice that we didn't touch on that the panelists kind of want to share in terms of just things that we should be aware of or that could help us with that with fellowships or to just make it a little easier?
Keep reaching out through the whole process. Keep seeking help from people who are more experienced or more advanced in the areas. Find some role models. Find some people to talk to, and like don't stop asking questions. Like basically like don't take the seminar and then don't ask more questions. Like keep seeking more information. It will always help you.
Yeah, that's good advice. And pick a good PI, someone who will really help provide you with good input.
I think something I've come to appreciate is that the hardest part is me convincing myself that it's a really good idea scientifically. And once I'm sure I have something that's exciting and like a real, not only gap in the knowledge, but an important one, an exciting one to fill, then to me, grant writing and fellowship writing is just a game of how can I convince someone else of this thing that I'm sure about? And then it's fun to me. It's like, how do I convince this funding organization for whatever they're looking for that this thing I'm already really excited about and I'm sure is important? How do I convince them? And how do I make sure the experiments are as good as possible? And I think it's good to view it as fun, but you do have to be really convinced that what you're doing is important and exciting first.
Awesome. Okay, we do have one question in the chat that popped up. But thank you guys for the advice. That's all super helpful. Natalie is wondering where on the GRFP solicitation, does it say what kind of research they are funding?
Well, they are funding all kinds of research, just to be clear. Like, even when they do put like a specific topic in there, they're not saying everything else gets thrown in the trash. But I would have to go look. I would have to go digging. It was not a super easy find. It was kind of in a weird PDF that wasn't on the main site, like in the directory, and like, yeah. I think I originally found the link to it through Twitter, actually, or sorry, X.
Yeah, I think I found something and I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Yeah, I think Yael also put like the budget on there.
And that one's
But
actually
I think-
last year's, because it's fiscal year 24. I can send fiscal year 25.
Yeah.
And Luciana brings up a good point that I guess we didn't touch on, but also social media I found, especially like science Twitter, is very helpful for the most part, especially a lot of the trainees that are on there. So like if you were to post questions like these, like, hey, I'm applying to the NSF, is there something that we should, like some hidden PDF that I should know about that might not be super accessible? Because let's be honest, a lot of these agencies aren't exactly known for being the most accessible. It's always good to reach out. Best case scenario, honestly, if somebody says no, there's nothing else there, don't worry about it. Worst case scenario, you just have to read another PDF, but you get all the information out of it.
It can also help to find example statements for rarer fellowships. Like people have mentioned, there are repositories online for the NSF. You can find billion materials online. You can find F31. But I recently applied to the Schmidt Fellowship, which is kind of one that's like when you're finishing your PhD and going into postdocs. And that one, I didn't find examples online. So I found that a few of my mutuals on Twitter had it. And so I just DM'd them and, asked if they'd be comfortable Zooming about the fellowship first. And then over the course of that, we got to the point where I asked, are you comfortable like sharing any of your materials? And they were happy to. So it can be helpful to find examples for like rarer. And if not examples, it's fine. No one is, you don't have a right to anyone's application ever. But if they're willing to chat with you, great. If they're willing to share materials, wonderful. And I've found people generally very willing.
And we had one other thing in the chat, just one last thing before we head out. Saidi was wondering if anybody like needs help looking at application statements, for example, like the Gilliam Fellowship, would they be able to reach out to the panelists?
Sure.
I'm happy to look at Gilliam materials, as long as people give me time to look at them and give me like, don't be like, I need them back tomorrow. But
Dr.
yes, you can
Yael,
reach out.
I'm taking your offer on that because I'm actually applying to.
Yeah, I do environmental sciences, so don't send me the medical or the engineering, but I could probably be willing to look at other things.
Unfortunately, I'm happy to share materials, but I'm crunching on research right now, so I do not have the time to look at specific statements.
Yeah, and if there are like mentees or mentors in here, also feel free to use like the Slack channels that we have to like ask people to if like anybody has applied and if they're willing to share experiences. That's what Científico Latino is for, is to build that community. And or even if you want to reach out directly to like some of the program directors and we can help you get you to the right channels, do not hesitate to reach out to us. Like this is what we're here for. And so please feel free to reach out to us. We can make sure we get you guys to the right people. But I think it's 4. So we want to thank you to the panelists so much for all the insight. This was so helpful for everybody here. And we're super appreciative of you guys taking the time out of your day, especially very busy days, to sit down with us and share your knowledge and wisdom. So thank you guys so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. And we'll be sending this recording out to you as well to all the mentees and mentors. So be on the lookout for that.
Okay.
All right. See y'all.
Thank you.